All right, hello again. David here to do my presentation on the Pro Tools setup with the dashboard and settings. So let's go ahead and jump in. So when we open up Pro Tools, we're going to have the dashboard as our window that prompts us to select the type of session and name the session and save it in certain locations. We also set the sample rate and bit depth of the audio that we're going to be recording. So talk first about naming projects. You think about file management is an important thing with computer work, especially with audio, and being able to find things is sometimes a daunting task if you call all your projects untitled. 1 and untitled, 3 and 4 and 5. So one of the big things with finding your projects and naming them is thinking about 3 years from now, what are you going to remember about this project? What are the important components of this project and important aspects that you might want your client to have? So an example is in my classes, I have folks use their first and last name, underscore, and the course number. So we'll do 1063 and which project this is or which assignment. So 3 different kind of components to the name, but that helps me as the instructor identify which student this is, what class this is, and which project this is. So file management and naming. Sweet. So going down to the next section here, we have local storage as basically where we're going to be saving your project. You can also sometimes have collaborative cloud-based things if you sign up for the cloud-based Pro Tools version. So that's something you might utilize if you're collaborating with somebody and both of you have cloud backup accounts. Another thing folks like to use sometimes is templates. So I don't have time to get into the weeds here with the templates, but more or less you open up one of these templates and it's going to have tracks already created for you. It'll have things like MIDI tracks and instrument tracks that fit the blues genre. You'll have an auxiliary input track that's used as headphone monitors, and then a master fader and some effects returns. So that's basically what you'll find in the templates folder, and that might be good for your workflow if you want to start out with all the tracks kind of built ahead of time. Another thing you can do is create your own templates. If you open up Pro Tools and you build a session that has the tracks that you usually use, and you can label them and put effects and plugins on them and do whatever type of routing you might need as a starting point, and you can go and save as a template. So you can also create your own templates that way too. Okay, cool. So we won't be doing that today, but moving on down to the bottom here, we have the file type. So you have 2 options for file type on this version of Pro Tools. You have the WAV file format, also known as WAV files, and you have AIFF. So basically these are 2 high quality non-compressed audio file formats, and one was developed by Microsoft, which is the WAV file format, and then the AIFF is Apple's kind of version of that. So most people use the WAV file because it's going to be compatible across most platforms and works with every DAW I've ever interacted with, even on the PC side. So that would be my recommendation, is using WAV files, but you can also use AIFF if you're mainly using Apple. All right, cool. So down to sample rate and bit depth. So this is essentially the quality of the sample, the audio sampling. So sample rate, if you notice, is in kilohertz. Kilohertz is how we, the unit of measurement for frequency, also known as pitch, but basically it's cycles per second, or divisions of the waveform per second. And I've got kind of an example here. I'll pull up here real quick. But at lower sample rates, you have larger blocks that kind of sample the audio of a waveform that's usually naturally kind of more of a smooth thing. And at a higher sample rate, you have smaller portions of that waveform sampled. Okay, so you're basically the higher the number, the higher the quality. Now, CD quality, which has been kind of the standard, is 44.1 kilohertz. And the reason they settled on this is it's twice the audible frequency spectrum. So humans can hear about 20 hertz through 20,000 hertz. So Nyquist and the Nyquist theory was that you need, for digital audio, you need twice the frequency range as a sample rate to be able to make the audio accurate. So a little bit of history physics back there, but essentially most times you can record at a higher sample rate. Sometimes you go all the way up to 96. If you're recording, things in the film industry and sound effects and stuff like that, you might want to go crazy high quality. But mainly, most folks that I've learned from and worked with record at 48 kilohertz, which is just a step above 44.1. And now on over to bit depth. Bit depth is very similar, but it's talking about the amplitude of the wave file and how many sort of points of division there are for the amplitude. So here's kind of an example of that, where we have a larger number of divisions of the amplitude measurement, and then you have smaller divisions of the amplitude. So it's kind of a similar thing to sample rate, but speaking to the amount of divisions of the waveformat's amplitude. Cool. So once again, CD quality is 16-bit. So people record one step above that usually. So I recommend in my classes that we go with 24-bit and 48 kilohertz, and then we downsample to 1644.1 when we're finished with the project and mastering it and exporting the final bounce. Cool. So under I/O settings, you can use various kind of templates almost for the inputs from different devices. Like if you have different interfaces that you might choose from that you bounce between, a home computer that has one interface and another computer at work that has interface of a different nature. You can have these, preset inputs and outputs. Last used is going to basically utilize the names of the inputs and outputs from the previous project. So most of the time I tell folks to use the stereo mix, because you're starting from a fresh basic naming scheme for the outputs in the buses and everything. So recommend using stereo mix for that. Interleaved basically is the type of audio that we listen to on a mastered finished track. So if you're playing something in your Apple Music or some sort of media player, you're playing a stereo interleaved file. It's 2 tracks summed together, interleaved. So it's still left and right stereo, and you get all the stereo effects, but it's one file. So when we mix and master and work on audio, we're usually doing it in the mono situation, like one microphone at a time. That's one signal, one mono signal. So usually you don't check the interleaved unless you want to work with a bunch of stereo tracks. Okay, cool. So down here, the location of, this is the location at which I'm going to save my project. So if I save my project to my desktop, it will show up on the desktop. If I save it to an external hard drive, I can click here on the location. I can choose a different location to save things. So that's an important thing to note as well, because you don't want to save a project and then have no idea where it is. So just as an example, I want to show you a Pro Tools session file. So when you save this and create this session, it's going to save a file folder that looks like all the other file folders on your computer, but it is a Pro Tools session, and it's got contents in it, sacred contents that should not be disrupted. So let me just save this on my desktop so I have a more recent one. There we go. Okay, so this is the project folder that I just saved, my first and last name, project 1. If I open that, this is the sacred arrangement of important files and folders that you don't want to disturb. A lot of students will grab this Pro Tools session and they'll turn it in, or they'll take it to another location and drop it somewhere. But none of this is going to work. Your Pro Tools session will not open correctly unless you have all the accompanying other files. And as you notice, this is 48 kilobytes, so it's a very tiny file. And then all your bulky, larger files are going to be in the audio files folder, which take up the most of the space of the project. But basically, you want to keep this folder intact, keep it, you can compress it before you send it somewhere. But it's something that you don't want to disturb because you can have some serious problems later down the line. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and back up a little bit. I wanted to, in addition to this, also talk about system settings and the interface options. So for system settings, the main thing that we're dealing with is when you use a digital audio workstation, you're going to have audio being fed into it from an interface that's usually connected through some sort of FireWire or USB cable, and that is going to be receiving the audio and playing the audio back and outputting it. Your computer also has built-in microphones and built-in speakers, and there's also other applications that utilize your playback engine or audio drivers. So to adjust this stuff, like if you're listening to your project and you can't hear any sound and nothing seems to work, you go to Setup and you go to Playback Engine. And this is where you can set the playback engine, which is basically like it's where you're choosing to get the audio from and put the audio out to. And you want to select your interface. Okay, so my interface that I have on this system right here is a PreSonus Quantum. So I select the Quantum, and usually it asks me to reset things, but you can also choose to have like your built-in microphone or built-in output of your computer as well, headphone jack or something like that. So you can make those selections here. Another location that you might need to check if you're having trouble hearing audio is going into your system settings on your Mac, and under the sound category of your system settings, you have the input and the output setting for your computer. So if you're playing back stuff from like your music media player or listening to stuff off of a web browser and you're not hearing it through your headphones or not coming out of your interface, you might need to adjust the input and the output to be the Quantum. But usually this syncs up when you adjust it on the DAW or you turn on your interface. It'll kind of like the computer recognizes it. So those are the couple places you would problem solve for your interface not receiving sound. Okay, cool. Let me switch gears here, and I want to do the demo that I had prepared for the other aspect of this this teaching demo, which was going to be over using EQ. So I'm go ahead and open up a session that already exists here and talk a little bit about using equalizers on different types of instruments. All right, so question is, explain the best setting for different types of instruments with EQ. So I'll talk generally about EQ, and then we'll do a couple kind of application demos on EQ on different instruments. So what EQ is, it's short for equalizer, equalization or something to that effect. Most EQs give you a range of filters. So let me just pull up an EQ real quick here. Okay, here we go. So this shows you the frequency spectrum. This is the audible frequency spectrum that we all kind of work with in audio. 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, 20K. And that's basically what humans can, hear. There are two main tools that you kind of use first. The most common are the high pass filter, which essentially is a curve that rolls off and removes the low frequencies and lets the high frequencies pass. Okay, so this is like, I want to remove the low frequency aspect of my voice and make it, a little bit less bassy. You can use this to do that. Or I want to remove the kick drum that's going into my snare drum mic. My snare drum's a higher frequency sound, but the kick drum's right next to it, so I hear the kick drum all the time. Well, I can use this to filter that out. The opposite side of things is the low pass filter, which does exactly the opposite. Low pass filter lets the low frequencies pass by, and it removes the high frequencies. You know, an example of that is I have a kick drum, a you know, the floor drum of a drum set, very bassy, and it's also picking up cymbals and snare drums and all the other sounds around it. Well, if I want to focus on just hearing the kick drum, I can use this low pass filter to kind of filter out the frequencies that I don't want to hear and focus more on that kick drum. So a lot of it's like removing things that you don't want from a sound. Okay, Q is, I'm kind of tooling with these two parameters on these low pass and high pass filters, one of which is the slope. So Q is kind of like the slope of this, the curvature of this filter. It can be very extreme, or it can be a little bit more gradual, okay? And then the frequency is basically the frequency point at which it starts sloping off the sound of that frequency, that filter. Going down to the bottom, we have several more filters. I'll just talk about the big basic ones. The low frequency filter, also known as a low shelf filter. This is a it's a little bit less intense than, like, you know, if you wanted to use a high pass filter and remove the bass, you can use this instead, where you kind of minimize, you kind of tap the bass frequencies down by a certain decibel level, and you don't totally remove them. So if you just want to like take a little bit of the bass frequencies down subtly, you might use a shelf. You can also boost these subtly too. There's a low shelf and then there's a high shelf. So it can be like for, you know, subtly removing some of the higher frequencies or subtly boosting some of the higher frequencies. It kind of goes both ways. It also has a Q, which basically makes that slope a little bit more gradual or intense. You know, the gain is basically how many, you know, decibels of gain or reducing of gain that you would do to, you know, to level that sound out. All right. On to the other type of filter. This is what we would call either a band pass filter or a notch filter. If you're using it as a band pass filter, usually I see it described as this when you're boosting a certain frequency. So it's kind of like a bell curve here, where there's a certain frequency that you want to hear a little bit more of, and maybe it's, you know, 500 or 4K. You kind of listen around by sweeping this back and forth, and you can hear the frequency that you like or not, or you don't like, and you can focus in on it and kind of boost it a little bit right here, and do the same thing with another filter, kind of like find these little frequencies that are kind of where the instrument shines, and you can kind of like poke them out a little bit and boost them a bit. You can also use the same process for finding a frequency that you don't like and removing it from the mix. So basically you're putting the gain down on this one frequency that sounds not great. It's conflicting with other sounds, or it's just a kind of not a friendly frequency to the ears, or doesn't fit the sound. You can remove that frequency by using it as a notch filter. That removes it. Okay, so let's bounce to a couple applications real quick. First thing here is looks like we got ourselves a kick drum track. So I'm going to go ahead and play that kick drum track, and this is the EQ that's on it. So if you can listen to that, you can hear that it's a kick drum, of course, but I also hear cymbal and snare. Okay, so I like the sound of the kick drum, but I don't want to hear cymbals and kick drum in the kick drum mic or snare. I have other mics that have those sounds on them. So to remove that, I would probably try to use a low pass filter. So now that I've applied that low pass filter, we hear less of the snare and less of the cymbals, and I can kind of dial that in until I don't hear, you know, enough, or I don't hear, you know, a decent amount. So you're always finding a happy balance. So something like this, I can still hear the kick drum, but I hear a lot less of the cymbals. Okay, so another demo would be like maybe doing this on a snare drum. So another key instrument in the drum set is the snare drum. I'll put a EQ on this track and solo it, so we just hear the snare drum. So I can kind of hear the kick drum in my snare drum mic. The kick drum is a low frequency instrument, where the snare drum is kind of a, you know, mid to upper range instrument. So I might use the opposite, a high pass filter, to kind of remove that kick drum from the sound of the snare mic. Okay, so there's an example of EQ on a snare drum. Oftentimes it's very close to the kick drum mic or to the kick drum itself, so it helps to filter out the frequencies that you don't need but are bleeding into that mic from neighboring instruments. Okay, maybe one more example here. Let's go with a human voice, and unfortunately we're going to have to listen to my voice here, but one of the things that happen with a voice is when you sing into a microphone, especially when it's really close. I'll just demo it here. As you get closer to the microphone, it gets bassier. So it's called proximity effect, where the mic creates this fake bass response on a sound of an instrument if you get really close to the diaphragm of the mic. So one of the things that I often tend to do with voice tracks is remove some of that low frequency and then find some of the nicer frequencies that make that sound come alive and help the vocal track fit into the mix, so it's not conflicting with bass instruments and guitar instruments that are in the lower range.
And also relaxing, but like a snake it creeps complacency. I need a little chaos to know that I'm alive, living for the moment and trying not to die.
So I'm attempting to remove some of the lower aspects of the voice. There's kind of a fine line between too much and not enough, so you're kind of listening hard and finding the sweet spot to where you're causing the voice to not be too thin. Another thing you might do, and this is another technique for using these EQ filters, these bandpass and notch filters, is to fish around and find frequencies that you find pleasing or don't find pleasing.
Why do you fear death is coming for us all?
So this frequency right here, about 500 hertz, I'm not really a big fan of it. It's
live your best life.
It sounds a little boxy to me, so I could do with less of it. So I'm going to dip that frequency down with a negative amount of gain.
Don't be afraid to fall.
Maybe a little bit more subtle, and I can take that frequency out of the mix a little bit. Another thing I'll do is most of the articulation sibilance of the voice is up top, and the sibilance is like the consonants, like sh, ka, p, t, all those kind of sounds of the articulation of a voice, and those kind of live up in the higher register. So I might fish around.
The time is right now, don't waste another day.
And find some of those.
Here comes that snake, known as complacency. Complacency.
So I can find some of the frequencies that I like and give them a little bit of a boost. So you're using these tools to basically mold and sculpt the tonal sound of instruments. You also use them to eliminate bleed from other instruments as a way of kind of mediating the reality of a drum set with 10 mics on it, and everything's loud and it's all right next to each other. So that's how you can deal with the crossover between sounds going into mics that they're not intended to. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful, and thanks for tuning in. Take care.